Good afternoon and welcome to today's SAMHSA-sponsored webinar titled The Role of Peer Supporters in Mobile Crisis Response and Respite Services on behalf of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, also known as NAMI. Today's presentation will be recorded, and the recording link, slides, and a certificate of attendance will be sent via email to everyone who attended today. Closed captioning is available and can be viewed by clicking on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen or clicking the link in the chat pod to view in a separate window. We also have an ASL interpreter who should see spotlit on your screen. During the presentation, please add your questions and comments into the chat box, and questions will be asked out loud for the presenters to answer at the end of the presentation. When the presentation ends today, a brief survey will show in your browser. Please take a few moments to complete that for us. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll now turn it over to Katie Harris to give us an overview of today's presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Harris, and for greater accessibility, I'll provide a visual description of myself. I'm a 26-year-old white woman with blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black turtleneck today. And I am the senior coordinator for the Research, Support, and Education team at NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And NAMI is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization, serving individuals and their family members through education, support, and advocacy. And we're excited to partner with SAMHSA and NASHBID in bringing you today's webinar. So today's conversation, if we could go back to that other slide. Thank you. Today's conversation is going to be about the role of peer supporters in mobile crisis response and respite services with Susan Morris and Vic Welly. And if we could go to the next slide now. Here's our disclaimer. Next slide, please. So what we hope you will learn from attending today is that you'll hear experiences and perspectives of peer support specialists in mobile crisis teams and peer-run respite. We hope that you will learn how peer support specialists provide an in-person crisis or provide in-person crisis services to individuals with mental health conditions, including serious mental illness. And we hope that you will understand the benefit of mobile crisis teams and peer-run respite options as an alternative to law enforcement or traditional emergency departments. So next slide, please. So Susan and Vic are going to tell you a little bit more about themselves when they introduce you, but I just wanted to say that in the conversations that I've had with both of them leading up to this presentation, I've really just been inspired by the way that they've taken their own experience and their own history with mental health conditions and used that to show up for people who are currently experiencing crisis and needing some more support. So it's been really wonderful to get to know both of them, and I'm looking forward to hearing their experience today and for you all to learn from them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Susan to get us started.
Great afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Morris. And as a visual description for greater accessibility, I am an African-American female who looks 40. And I currently have long blonde braids. I'm wearing a black top accented with white and red, and I wear glasses. And I am going to be starting us up today. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself first. I am the program coordinator for a agency called Lutheran Social Services, and I'm over the I Help Shelter, the Phoenix I Help Shelter, and I Help stands for Interfaith Homeless Emergency Lodging Program. A little bit more about myself. How I ended up in this industry was kind of by accident. After finishing college, I went to the University of Arizona. I ended up smoking that new smokable form of cocaine called crack, and I ended up losing 20 years of my life. And in losing that 20 years, I lost jobs. I also lost my children. And after my father passed away, I cleaned up and I went back to school just to see if I had any brain cells left, in all honesty. And I ended up in corporate America because I could finally get a job because I was always in jail. In corporate America, I became a trainer. Life looked really great. But a friend of mine came to my home one day and she was in crisis. And she says, Susan, I need to go to rehab. And I said, well, let me figure out what to do. And from that, she said to me, you know, you'd really be good at peer support. And I looked at her and I said, what's that? And I looked it up online. There was a position available with a company here in Phoenix, and the rest has been history. And so I'm excited to be here with you today to talk about mobile team peer support. It's harmony and versus not balance. So let us begin. So do we have any singers in the house or musicians in the house today? Because I'm sure we do. And let me tell you a little bit about what it was like for me when I was a kid. So I was not allowed to play outside because my father, who was the neighborhood preacher, thought I would be influenced by the negative children in the neighborhood. So instead, I stayed in my room and listened to the AM, FM radio. And eventually I was allowed to buy some records and I would play them over and over again. I was sing everybody's part to the point where now I naturally hear harmony. And so from the Beatles to a symphony to even Parliament Funkadelic, what makes music great isn't just the simplicity of the melody line, but it's the movement of the harmony within the melody. It's not great artists trying to perform the same key the same way. It's great artists working in their strengths by blending their tones, and then the music transforms synergistically into something magical. And so what does that have to do with peer support and mobile crisis? Everything, absolutely everything. And so here is a picture of a typical mobile crisis team out in the field. And so a mobile team is comprised of two people, which can provide safety and perspective. They're helping one person sometimes requires 4 eyes, 4 ears, and 1 mouth, because one person is talking at a time, so not to confuse and overwhelm the person in crisis. Usually at least one of the persons on the mobile team is a clinician. They're either a BHT, behavioral health tech, or a BHP, behavioral health professional. And depending upon your agency rules, the other person can be peer support. And in mobile team, we have our partners 6, S-I-X. You will hear that out in the field. And it's a military term, meaning one person is watching the 12 o'clock, the other person is watching the 6 o'clock. So we have each other's backs. Egos must be put aside because every crisis call has to be taken seriously. And you literally have someone's life in your hands, and sometimes your own. And so I'm going to describe to you a typical mobile team call. And so I'm going to be using some clinical terms and some acronyms. And so the first one is police and fire calls. How those usually happen are a family, a friend, or a stranger calls the police or the fire department regarding a person in crisis. And based on the call, the police department or fire dispatches mobile team as a backup. Mobile team will see something called DTS, danger to self. And it could be non-suicidal self-injury to suicidal ideation. And so what that means is this: non-suicidal self-injury could be a person who's cutting their skin with objects, or suicidal ideation could be suicidal thoughts with a plan. In other words, they know how they're going to do it. They may have means, meaning they know what they're going to use. Or they also may have intent. They are dedicated to completing the plan. And mobile team is asking those questions. Another typical call may be DTO, danger to others. And this can go from threatening and intimidating to physical violence on others. And so it could be anger with threats. It could be property damage. It could be physical violence or homicidal thoughts with a plan, means, or intent. Another call that mobile team receives is psychosis. And in the simplest terms, a psychosis is a person may have difficulty recognizing what is real and what is not. And this may be caused because a person was taking some form of psychiatric medication. They were feeling better. I don't need the meds anymore. And they decided to get off of their medication. Or it could be drug induced. A person may take some form of a drug. It could be any type of legal drug or illegal drug. And the next thing you know, they're in psychosis. Here in Arizona, because marijuana is legal. Oh yes, and it could be from the medication itself. Absolutely, thank you. I think it's JSIC or Jack. Thank you, Jack. Here in Arizona, marijuana is legal. And so we were receiving calls that a person was smoking someone else's marijuana pen and ended up in psychosis. It happens a lot here because, once again, it's legal. Or what could happen is a person may have dementia or Alzheimer's. That falls under psychosis. Or something that a lot of people don't know about is urinary tract infections. A urinary tract infection, one of the side effects or the symptoms of it is psychosis. And so these are the questions that a mobile team is asking a person as they are trying to assess them to what's the best, what are their next best steps. Last but not least for mobile team are the CISD calls, the critical incident stress debriefings. These are folks who have completed suicide, or it's a homicide, or it could be a natural death, heart attack. A family member has walked in and found a family member or friend, and they have passed away. And so what's happening is the mobile team is providing resources, helping them get phone calls to family members to let people know. Basically, the mobile team is there for support. And all of these calls can be either children or adults, all nationalities, all races. Crisis does not discriminate. A typical person seeking services. General mental health, GMH. So a person who falls under GMH could have depression, anxiety, PTSD. They could have bipolar disorder. This person may go into crisis and will get the call to go out and see what's going on. A person may have a serious mental illness, SMI. This person may have depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, and have all four of them instead of just one or two. They also may have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. They may have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. The main difference, for clarity, between an SMI diagnosis and a general mental health diagnosis is that the SMI diagnosis is given when a person's mental health hinders their quality of life. It stops them from functioning within the community, and their quality of life starts to go down. Another person seeking services may be our seniors. And so once again, that's when we see the dementia, the Alzheimer's, the urinary tract infections, on top of maybe having a general mental health diagnosis or an SMI diagnosis. Another group that we see often are our unhoused persons, and this is both adults and children. Here in Arizona, because Arizona has moderate weather most of the time, except in the summertime where it's horribly hot here. We have so many adults and children living in cars, living in the parks, living at the bus stops. We get a lot of calls for people who are unhoused here in Arizona, and they're seeking services and they are in crisis. Another group that we may see are adults and children with developmental disabilities, DDD. So they may be on the spectrum, which is a way for saying that a person has autism. They may have a learning disability. They may have an intellectual disability. They may have a birth injury. We'll get calls on them because they've gone into crisis. Something has triggered them, and wherever they are staying is unable to calm them down. And they'll bring crisis team out to assess them to see what's going on. Another group that we may see are children in group homes and in foster care. And for those that don't know, what happens is CPS or DCS has removed them because of neglect, abuse, or trauma. And they get triggered at the foster homes. And so crisis team comes in, assesses the situation, and then has to make a decision as to what are the next best steps for the children in these foster homes, whether it is we community stabilize them in the home, or do they need to go to something called higher level of care and to be assessed by a psychiatrist or a therapist. And then last but not least, children with multiple mental health diagnoses. And these children may be in the home with their parents, a relative, a family member, grandparents. And what happens is, like our children in foster care, we are assessing to see what's going on and what are their next best steps. And depending upon the peer support experience, if you have lived through this, then guess what? We can assist with these individuals. Okay, we're going to talk about next the peer support role in crisis team. So the main thing is this: share your experience, strength, and hope to the person who is in crisis. If you have lived experience, share this with them and let them know how you made it through. Shine, because as peer supports, we have worked through our personal demons where the clinician maybe has not. They may not have a history of trauma. They may not have a history of addiction as we may. And so this is where we shine because we are relatable to the person who is in crisis. Number 3, know your role. Effectively communicate with all parties with discretion. And I say that with discretion is because of this. It was explained to me that peer support may or may not do clinical work, such as a mental status exam, depending upon the agency, the state that you're in. However, what happens is as we're telling our story, we just have to be mindful not to re-traumatize the person who we are helping. We got to be able to gauge where to start and where to stop. And it is important to listen to the questions that the clinician is asking. And so they're asking clinical questions to determine the next clinical and legal steps for the person who is in crisis. But what may happen is, as you're listening to the clinician and you're listening to the person who's in crisis, you may have some questions yourself. The clinician may put a name to what's bugging your spidey senses. So I'm going to use an example. Me and my partner, Jay, were called out to a call here in Phoenix, and it was a 10-year-old male who was hitting his grandmother. The call came from the uncle who was living in the home. It was a complicated call, and grandma denied that there were problems. The 10-year-old was receiving services in the school. However, the uncle was just sitting on the stairs, shaking his head in disbelief that the grandmother was saying that there was nothing wrong. But what caught my attention about this 10-year-old was his facial structure was unusual. He looked like he had a very, very, very mild case of Down syndrome, minus the classic other features or symptoms. When we left, I asked Jay what was going on with him. I asked her, I said, was that Down syndrome? And she looked calmly at me and said, nope. She says, that's FAS. That's fetal alcohol syndrome. And once she said that, it was like a Rubik's Cube came together in my brain. She put a name to what was bugging my spidey senses. And so ask questions. The next thing, you guys, is this. Remember the 20-80 rule. You're going to talk 20% of the time to get the person in crisis to talk 80% of the time. Make it safe for them to tell their story once again without re-traumatizing them with yours. We get excited. We do. But the more you do this, the better you will get at doing the 20-80 rule. So why harmony and not balance? So number one, harmony means that you're working in your strength while the other person is working in their strength. Everybody wins. Balance means that everything is even, which is impossible because you're an organic creature. You're not a machine. You balance machines, not people. We are living and breathing creatures. We take in air, we take in water. And if we are trying to be the same, what happens is we are trying to be who we're not, And then we start judging our insides by someone else's outsides. Work in your strength. Harmony allows you to have good listening skills, and you can hear what's not being said while you are using your other senses. Peer support has the advantage of hearing in three-part harmony. We naturally hear the emotions, the tone, and the tempo of people in crisis. Our unique listening skills and abilities make it safe for them to talk about themselves. And this will make it easier for your clinician partner to make a more accurate assessment and diagnosis of the person's condition. And lastly, harmony creates less stress and animosity within a mobile crisis team. So believe me, I have seen this. There is nothing worse than when team members are at war with each other. It is a hot mess. Oh my goodness. And so people, stay in your strength. And so, lastly, what are the dilemmas and transformations of being peer support on a mobile crisis team? So we're going to start off with the dilemmas first. The first one is compassion fatigue. And a lot of times this happens when we've absorbed people's stories. We have absorbed them to the point where we become mentally and physically sick. There is the elusive overtime. So let me tell you, all money is not good money. Many times the crisis teams are understaffed, and so overtime is available. And it sounds great, but what happens is with the compassion fatigue, you end up burning out, you end up becoming physically sick. And so what happened with me personally was with mobile crisis, we were driving all over Phoenix. Now, mind you, Phoenix is huge. The Phoenix metropolitan area, I can't even tell you how many thousands of square miles it is. Literally, it's thousands of square miles because Phoenix Metro is huge. We could drive one side of Phoenix, which is on the far east side, and then drive another hour and a half, 2 hours to the other side of Phoenix on a crisis call immediately afterwards. What happened with me is we were driving so much, I ended up with sciatica, and I did not pay attention to what my body was telling me. One evening, I got out of the van and all I could do was scream. I just screamed at the top of my lungs. My back went out, which threw out my right knee. I could barely walk afterwards, and I am still in physical therapy today. I am much better than I was, but I was doing too much overtime. I am a prime example of what not to do. You have to pay attention to your body. And so here's one of the solutions. You have to decompress, you guys. Decompress means therapy. Go seek support. Attend recovery meetings. Take your medications. Therapy is your friend. Talk to somebody about what is going on. Number 2, exercise. I personally swim. That's how come I have a picture of her swimming right here. That's not me. But do something physical with your body. Swim, run, walk, hike, do some yoga, ride a bike. Motion is physical and mental lotion. Find a hobby, especially if you're in recovery. Cooking, gardening, using your hands. Do something that doesn't require you to think logically. Create music and sing. Do an activity that brings you joy and brings beauty into the world. And lastly, seek inner peace. whether it be spiritually, whether you have a higher power, whether you go to church. Understand who you are and whose you are. And here is our real life mobile team. So this is me and Jay. And she's my former partner. And we were different as night and day, religion-wise and upbringing. She is the clinician. She is getting her license. And I promise you, I learned as much from her as she did from me. And we still call each other for advice. And so peer support, I want you to embrace your strength. I want you to seize the day and understand that we have a superpower that is unmatched. And thus endeth the lesson. And I'm going to now turn it over to Vic Willie.
Thank you so much, Susan. Looks like, yes, I am spotlit. Folks can see me and I can advance to the next slide. So thank you everyone for being here. I'll start by sharing a little bit about me. Again, my name is Vic Welly. Pronouns are they, them. As a visual description of myself, I am a white genderqueer person with short brown hair that is starting to turn gray. I'm wearing glasses with bright blue frames, and I'm wearing a short sleeve collared shirt that has dark blue and gray stripes. And there's a blurred background where I'm calling in from my home office. I want to start by sharing some of the reasons why I am here today. And the first of my qualifications for talking about this topic of peer-run respite is my own personal lived experience. I'm somebody who has experience with disability. I was diagnosed with epilepsy as a teenager. And I'm somebody who has direct experience with times of crisis, and that includes times where I've wanted to die by suicide. And I'm also someone who has had some significant interactions with the psychiatric system. And while I do have a list of psychiatric diagnoses that would qualify as serious mental illness, I prefer to use language to talk about myself and my experiences that in less clinical, less medicalized ways. So I talk about being neurodivergent. And I also am someone who makes a lot of meaning of my experiences through a spiritual framework and not necessarily as a disease or an illness. So as I said, those experiences within the psychiatric system have not always been positive ones, and it's largely because of some of those harmful experiences that I was really drawn to peer support as a different way of interacting, both for my own healing and being in community with others who are struggling. So I've been working professionally as a peer support worker for about 10 years now, and many more years before that, before I knew that there was actually a job you could do as a peer support worker. And I was just giving and receiving support to others in my community. And I've also been a peer support trainer for about 7 years. And most significantly, I'm a trainer with intentional peer support. And I'm just going to offer a side note. Susan, I was so excited when you mentioned music and harmony, because one of the lessons in intentional peer support draws from the life experience of Sherry Mead, who is a musician. And she talks about this concept of making music together and how peer support is about improvising. And there's no one right way to do it. It's about really listening and playing together in a really intentional way. So one of the proudest experiences that I've had as a peer support worker is helping create Monarch House Peer Run Respite here in Wisconsin. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in the next few slides. And then finally, I want to say that related to my lived experience, I think it's important not to just talk about the bad things that happened to me, but it's also important for me to claim lived experience of finding healing in community with others. So what do we mean by peer-run respite? So Susan just outlined some examples of what it can look like when a person is experiencing crisis and they interact with some services that are centered in more medicalized and clinical services where peer support can be accessed. And peer-run respite is another model, and it is one that is intentionally non-clinical. And so I've got a definition here on this slide, and there's a lot of words to this definition, but each one I think is really important. And I also want to just name the photo here on the slide. This is a picture of the exterior of Monarch House Peer-Run Respite in Menominee, Wisconsin. So peer-run respite is voluntary. So anyone who comes to stay at a peer-run respite is coming because they want to be there. It's short-term. So the understanding is that while it might be that someone is experiencing crisis and are just needing a break from things, they may not be at a place where a hospital or some extended intervention would be a good fit. However, having a few days or a few nights up to a week to stay and get support would be a way of avoiding a more intensive intervention, like a psychiatric hold. So it's a voluntary, short-term, overnight, home-like space. And so when we say home-like, as much as possible, a peer-run respite is meant to look and feel just like any other home in a neighborhood. So when somebody comes to stay, they have their own bedroom. And it's not like a hospital bed, it's like an actual bed. And there's a kitchen, and there's a dining room, and there's arts and crafts and places to hang out. And a peer-run respite is available to anyone who is experiencing distress or crisis related to mental health, substance use, or similar life-interrupting challenges. And if you'll notice from the language that's used in that definition, it's purposely non-clinical. And the reason for that is because as peer support workers, we are not clinicians who give out diagnoses. And we also want to create a more expansive way for people to talk about what crisis is like for them. And so that it can include ways to explain what they're going through in more culturally relevant language, or it might be that someone is experiencing crisis for the first time and doesn't have a diagnosis or doesn't have that framework of explaining what they're going through in clinical language. So having this open-ended way of talking about it is a way to kind of get the conversation started in plain language where they can talk about things in their own words. And then finally, peer respites are meant to be community-based, non-medical, and operated entirely by people with similar lived experiences using a peer support model. And so what makes this approach unique? So first of all, it's that peer support approach. And there are a lot of different ways to explain what peer support means and how it's different from other crisis approaches for crisis intervention. But I think one of the things that's really important to highlight is that in peer support, there is an understanding that a lot of us have experienced systems where we had a loss of power and control within those systems. And whether that's being arrested during a mental health crisis and ending up in jail, whether that's being sequestered in an emergency room for long periods of time, whether that's being chaptered or put on a psychiatric hold. A lot of times, even with the best of intentions with those crisis interventions, we experience a loss of power, a loss of bodily autonomy, and things are done to us without our consent. And so peer support is meant to address that and meant to try to address some of those power imbalances that might happen in other services and be able to really connect in a mutual way where there's shared power and also shared responsibility. So in a peer respite, there is an understanding that if you are coming to stay, we are here to support you. And we also want to ask what support you can offer the rest of the people who are staying there. So for example, at Monarch House, there are 4 bedrooms. So there might be 4 people staying there, and they're receiving support from the peer support workers. However, they also might be supporting one another. And so this is a radically different way of offering support, and it's recognizing that we all have expertise, we all have something to offer. Peer respites are also unique because there is a low barrier in terms of cost. Here in Wisconsin, staying at a peer respite is free to any adult resident of Wisconsin. It's a way of staying in local community. So a peer respite is not like a locked facility like a psychiatric ward would be. So if somebody chooses to, they can continue to interact with their life in whatever ways make sense. So that could look like, for example, in Menominee, there's also a college in this town. And so if a student is going through a really extreme, stressful time in their life and they are navigating a crisis, and they're also really committed to finishing out the semester and they want to make it to that last final exam, they can go attend that exam and then come back to that supportive environment in the peer respite when they're done with that. Peer respites are unique because there is flexibility, choice, and options for what support can look like. So as peer support workers, we know from our own experience that there is no one size fits all for what will be supportive for someone. And so there is room to talk about what is it that you're hoping for from this stay. And that's what that initial conversation is about, is not prescribing what the intervention should be for the person, but just asking them, getting to know what's going on in your life. What are you hoping might be different as a result of staying here for a few days with us? And that gets to that last point on the screen about moving through crisis in a different way. And so one of the underlying values of peer-run respite is this understanding that crisis might not always be a terrible bad thing to be avoided at all costs. That if you look at one of the original definitions of crisis, it simply means a turning point for the better or the worse. And so it is one of those places where we can really pause and start to examine what is going on in my life that needs to shift. And can I take a few days to be supported in community, to take a look at that and think through that and maybe move through in a different way. So, let me move back one slide there. So again, who stays at a peer respite? Typically, it's adults 18 and over. It's really important that the person is self-referred and not mandated. So for example, if there is a crisis response team in your community and there's also a peer respite, it might be the case that a crisis worker will call and say, hey, I'm working with this individual. I'm a peer supporter. I'm working with this person who's in crisis. They're really interested in staying. And then my response would be, that's wonderful. I'd love to talk with them directly. Is there a place where you could hand them the phone, or are they able to call me directly so that I can have a direct conversation with them and find out, is this truly something that they are wanting? And are they able to speak freely and privately and find out from them directly if this is truly what they're wanting? And so again, are they wanting peer support to navigate that crisis related to mental health and or substance use, depending on the program? Some programs are only focused on mental health support. Others also create space for substance use challenges as well, because a lot of us know that there's a lot of intersection and overlap with a lot of those challenges. And sometimes that crisis could be that they are in the midst of the crisis, or it could be that they are wanting to avoid crisis. For those of us who are familiar with Wellness Recovery Action Plan or WRAP, there's a way of identifying what are those stressors in my life. How do I know when things are maybe getting to that breaking point where if I don't take some deliberate action to get some additional support, I might end up in a psychiatric facility again. And so can I seek out a peer respite as I navigate this really challenging time? And then other criteria is going to depend on the program and the funding. So some programs are funded by a local county or region. Here in Wisconsin, they are state funded. So again, they're open to anyone in the state. And then who works in a peer-run respite? It's your fellow community members. It's people like you who have gone through their own times of crisis, who have navigated their own challenges related to mental health or life-interrupting challenges, and are taking that step to give back and offer the support in a mutual way. And the trainings that are available for peer-run respite workers, again, intentional peer support is highly regarded, especially due to Sherry Mead's work in not only developing intentional peer support, but also the role that she played in creating the first modern peer-run respite here in the United States. And then other peer-developed trauma-informed approaches for trainings. So things like alternatives to suicide, Hearing Voices Network trainings are also really great interventions or great trainings. And what happens at a peer respite? What do you do? That can really depend, again, depending on who is staying at the peer respite and what kind of concerns or challenges folks are facing. But first and foremost, it's that connection with others. The peer respite model we know is based on this assumption that we heal in community, and that's in that relationship building that we develop those connections and we develop ways of navigating those challenges together. So it could be that giving and receiving of peer support, just hanging out with one another, not being alone. So it decreases that isolation that a lot of us experience when we're going through hard times. There could be some creative expression. Monarch House has a big room full of art supplies and crafts, and that's often something that folks enjoy. It could be connection to resources. And again, it's often those of us who have gone through these systems who know the most about what to access in the community. So it could be trading tips around where to find a better therapist, or who's the landlord who is easier to work with if housing is a challenge for you. Whatever it is that you're looking for, it's getting connected to those resources. Possibly exploring some wellness options if there are things you're wanting to try. One of the things that Monarch House created was getting some donations of fitness equipment, even a punching bag if someone wanted to use that to work through some emotions that way. And then rest. It is so important for a lot of us to get good rest. And there's a photo here on the screen where you can see an example of one of the bedrooms at Monarch House. I can tell you from my own experience, some of the worst sleep I ever got was when I was trying to sleep in psychiatric facilities, and I would constantly be woken up by those mental health technicians who would open the door to do that safety check, shine a light in the room. And it's really, I got to tell you, for me, it was really hard to get good sound sleep when there were strangers opening your door in the middle of the night. And at Monarch House, we let people know that your room is your own. We won't go into your bedroom without your consent. And you can sleep in as late as you want to. There's no set schedule. There's no curfew time. It's up to you to develop the schedule that works for you. There is an opportunity for shared meals. And there's a photo here again of the dining room table where a lot of good conversations happen. So those are just some of the examples of things that could happen at a peer-run respite. It really, again, depends on the folks who are coming to stay and what it is they're wanting and needing for support. So what difference does peer respite make? So some of the research that's been done into peer respite is included here on the slide, and I also included a link to some of the research done by Live and Learn. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is that in a 2015 study, respite guests were 70% less likely to use inpatient or emergency services as a result of having that pure respite experience. I know that a lot of us are not guided by dollars and cents and cost of things, but a lot of times policymakers and administrators are interested in what is the cost of this kind of program, and there is usually a very significant cost savings of funding pure respite programs compared to emergency room or inpatient interventions. And finally, the peer run respite model is being recognized worldwide as a way of promoting person-centered and rights-based approaches to mental health support. And this is based on AFIA, Peer Run Respite in Western Massachusetts, being recognized in a recent World Health Organization report. So typically when I do a presentation like this, there are some frequently asked questions, and I get that, but what about this? What about? And it's typically, what about the situations where a lot of fear comes up? And that includes, what about self-harm? What about talking about suicide? What about when someone is, quote unquote, really ill with that serious mental illness? Most often what people mean by that is they're talking about people experiencing reality in a different way, things that would be diagnosed as maybe psychosis. And then what's the role of substance use? And finally, the neighbors. What do you do with the neighbors? And often it's the neighbors who are asking those questions, that are wondering, what is this going to do to our neighborhood? We know from our own lived experiences that there's still a lot of fear and a lot of discrimination for those of us who go through the world with those labels. And I'm going to probably give a disappointing answer for some of you who are wanting a clear answer for each one of these. But because of the peer support model, each one of these is going to be based on conversation. It's going to be based on getting to know the person and learning more about the situation, and not making assumptions that because somebody has a history, for example, of substance use, that they wouldn't be able to stay. So I'll give an example of what this could look like. So if somebody is wanting to die by suicide, a lot of times it can be really hard for someone to want to seek out support because of the negative impact that can happen through emergency services, through sometimes police showing up at your door for a wellness check, or that risk of involuntary treatment. And so in a peer run respite setting, there is room to talk about suicide openly. And for those of us who've had that experience, we can be open about that and say, this is a place where you can talk about these hard things if you choose to. And we need to know from you what kind of support you're wanting from us. So it's a two-way street as far as giving and receiving information. So letting us know, what are you hoping for from us? Are you wanting some support in creating a wellness plan that will help you navigate this difficult time? Are you wanting to talk through the possible pros and cons of going to the hospital? Are you at a place where this is something you're considering? Or are you trying to avoid the hospital? And if so, what might that look like? But in the peer support model, we recognize that we are not in a place of being able to save people, and also not in a place of being able to control people. And that makes for some discomfort. It makes it really challenging. And it can be a transformative way for people to start having different conversations and to start talking about what is the underlying pain that isn't being able to be addressed in other spaces that's led you to coming here to seeking support. And so, like I said, these are not easy conversations to have, but they are so necessary because there are so few places in the world where those of us who experience these extreme states, who experience these deep times of distress, where we can feel safe to talk openly about these kinds of things. So I want to be mindful of the time and give space if there are any things that have been brought up so far that folks want to dive deeper into. I don't want to assume that folks want to take the conversation in any particular direction. So as I close, I just want to offer some resources if you want to continue learning more about peer-run respite. And so one resource I highly recommend is the Peer Respite Handbook, written by Sarah Davidow from AFIA, Peer Run Respite in collaboration with Intentional Peer Support. If you want to reach out to me directly, there's my email address there on the screen, vic@victoriawelly.com. And then finally, I want to invite folks who are part of peer respite programs currently or who are interested in developing peer respite programs. There is an emerging national coalition for peer-run respite programs, and there's the email on the screen there, peerrespiteorganizing@gmail.com. So I want to end it right there and allow space for questions and comments from the group. Thank you.
I was muted, but thank you so much, Vic. And we will start our Q&A session. So Susan, have you back? Excellent. All right. Yeah, just thank you both so much for sharing about your own experiences. And I feel really grateful that these peer-run options exist as an alternative to some traditional systems. And I know that in listening to your presentations, I'm learning also. And so just thank you for sharing about that. And I'll remind folks that if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. We're getting a couple coming in now, but not a whole lot during the presentation. So if you have a question, feel free to drop that. But I was jotting down a few as you were both talking. And so the first question that I wanted to ask you both is how, which I know, Susan, you talked to this during your presentation, but I'm curious to hear more about how you both stay grounded in your work. And when you're with somebody who is experiencing crisis, what is that like for you internally as you're sitting with somebody who's in that crisis space?
I'll start. I swim a lot, if you really want to know. Because I find that for me, the physical exercise was the one piece that I was missing. I've been through the therapy, I've been through the medication, I've been through the spiritual, after so many years of, I was a person who went to 11 different rehabs, so I could probably run a meeting with my eyes closed. I could, probably know more than the doctors, but there was still something missing deeply within me. And some of it was, number one, finding a hobby. And then number two was physical exercise. And I found that for me, swimming, because the only thing, if you're literally doing laps, the only thing you can really focus on is breathing. That is it. That is all. And I found that my, personal anxiety, whatever was going on with me, stayed in the water, and I got out and I was refreshed and renewed. So for me, that is a big piece, and I continue to swim every other day. and it has helped me tremendously.
Yeah, I'm not a swimmer, but definitely resonate with finding those ways to take care of yourself. And I think for me, I'm thinking about what do I do in the moment? And I think one of the challenging pieces, and I hear this a lot too when I do trainings, is how do I stay out of problem solving mode? How do I stay out of that urge to want to rescue or fix? And so I think it is really important to stay grounded in, can I just connect with you as a human being and connect with whatever emotions are showing up? Can I offer that validation if I can relate to what you're describing? Or can I just be present? Again, what you were mentioning earlier, Susan, that 80-20 about like, can I just keep my mouth shut, and just hold space and let people process in their own time? Because sometimes in crisis response, it can just be really important to offer space to slow things down. We have such a culture of urgency. We've got to get this fixed. We got to get this handled. We got to get this solved. Can we find a way to slow things down? Because a lot of times people know what they need. They just need the time and the space to figure it out.
I love that, Vic. And I think it also ties into the idea of harmony that Susan was talking about earlier, and playing to the strengths in a situation and not expecting yourself to, be the conductor and save others, but really just show up with what you have to offer. So I love that. And Susan, I totally understand that too. I enjoy running, and that's my space to just not be bothered and to be with my own thoughts. And it's really wonderful just to have that, to be able to be more present in other spaces. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I have a question about peer respite. So this is for Vic. Vic, would you mind talking a bit more about how peer respite is funded for the Monarch House specifically, or generally?
Yeah, so in Wisconsin, we're very fortunate that it is grant funded through legislation. Hopefully there will be some additional cost of living increases with that funding. So I'm going to use this opportunity for some advocacy. However, it is a really fortunate kind of model where it is built into the mental health funding for the state, that the state of Wisconsin has recognized that this is a public good, this is an effective intervention. And so they have funded 5 different peer respites throughout the state, and then a 6th one that is community specific for veterans. And other states have that similar grant funding model. There are others that are funded through county funding. I know through the pandemic and the ARPA funding, the American Rescue Act funding, there was some short-term funding where some respites have been started. I don't know if that funding will continue, but again, it is a challenging thing to advocate for. There are ways to do it, and I think it is something that really needs to be a focus of advocacy. So really, really push for models like this that can be successful and effective.
For sharing about that. And I had the curiosity come up of the prevalence of peer-run respite options across the United States. Do you have an idea of how accessible that is throughout the nation?
Not accessible enough. I believe there are at this point, close to 50 either in development or currently operating throughout the United States, but not in every state. So there are some states that have several, there are some that have none. It really varies. And then the structure and the type also varies. There are some that are more tied to clinical systems that are not entirely peer run, but are peer operated. So again, it's really going to depend and might take a little bit of homework. But folks are welcome to reach out to me if they want to learn more, get connected to what resources might exist in their state.
Thanks for that, Vic. All right. So a question for Susan. Okay, let me read this. Okay, so it's a question about the mobile crisis team itself.
Yes.
Is there a peer support specialist on every mobile crisis team? And is that always along with a clinician? Are there exceptions? Could you talk a little bit more about who actually shows up on that crisis team?
Absolutely. And so depending upon the agency, the agency determines if the mobile crisis team is comprised of behavioral health professional. That's usually a person who's licensed, behavioral health tech, or peer support is involved. For the agencies here in the Phoenix area, they are usually behavioral health techs, two health techs, or behavioral health tech with a behavioral health professional. Our city program, the city of Phoenix has the program that has the peer support working with a behavioral health professional. The agencies that have a peer support that's involved with that agency, the peer support is the third person, but they are not actually the person who goes out independently with the team, the two-person team. And so the city of Phoenix has recently started the program within, I think, the past year and a half to have peer support, but it's brand new here. Usually peer support was relegated to navigation, working with clients, or not clients, with people who are experiencing crisis, as housing navigation, or, helping them to get services, but not really as a two-person mobile crisis team. And so it's new here, and it's still in the works, but it seems to be catching fire. It's becoming more and more successful, and we shall see. And I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Susan. And to that point, I'm wondering if you would also both be willing to talk about kind of the evolution of peer support that you've seen, especially in the last couple of years. I know that there's the introduction of 988 as an alternative to 911. And like you were saying, Susan, that this support of peer support, on a broader level is newer. So I'm curious about how you've both seen that evolve recently.
Okay. I'll start. So I started off as peer support in housing, and my role was to help my people find housing, get them housing vouchers, making sure that they were set up with psych services through their clinics. I would go in and make sure everything was going well within the home. However, at that time, I was not qualified per se to be in mobile crisis. Even though I had the education, I didn't have enough time in the industry to be put on a mobile crisis team. As times have progressed, what's happened is the peer support model, being on a mobile crisis team, has arisen. Not sure how, my English is sometimes bad here, and I think that has come from the fact that people are really understanding how necessary peer support is with helping with people who are in crisis. A lot of times the clinicians, may have learned experience from schooling and learned experience on the job, but may not have walked through their own personal crisis, or not address their own personal stories. And the beautiful thing about peer support is one of the criteria here in Arizona is you have to work through your own story and your own history, because sometimes you can't, it's difficult to to walk somebody, what I call through the tunnel, unless you've been through the tunnel yourself. And the importance of peer support is just, it's gained so much credibility here in Arizona and nationally, that, you know, the way it was when I first got into peer support, I think it was 7 years ago, it is dramatically different than it was 7 years ago. So to see the peer support model within the city of Phoenix itself, it's through the fire department of the city of Phoenix, was just amazing. So I hope I answered that question.
And personally, I think this topic could be a whole nother webinar as far as how peer support is developed. I think it's important to highlight some of the radical roots of what's developed into the profession of peer support, that originally it wasn't a job that you did, it wasn't a certification, it was folks who were survivors of really harmful treatment within psychiatric facilities, or who had experienced the neglect of systems that were just not created for them. Who took it upon themselves to say, you know what, we can support ourselves. We can create different models. You know, we don't want a seat at your table. We want to make our own table. We want to make our own space. And that is how Peer Respites came to be. It wasn't about wanting to be part of any system. It was about wanting to create new models of how to go through crisis together, how to heal in community together. And then comes the role of funding, of like, well, how do we sustain this? How do we keep it going? And so that's where I think are the really essential conversations to have about how much do we interact with systems? Do we take the funding? And if we take the funding, can we remain committed to the model of peer support that is still grounded in challenging systems and calling them out when they do harmful things? And I think that's a tension that is still being worked out in peer support communities. I don't think there's agreement about how much to work within systems or to stay outside of them. And I personally am here for those conversations and really hope that those conversations continue. And my hope is that funding can just be allocated, that it can just be recognized that peer support is a good. It has that evidence base, and we know that it's beneficial long term. And so I would just advocate for give us the dollars, we will use them well, and we will use them responsibly and find ways to heal together.
Thank you both so much for that. Okay, so next question, which I'll just read directly from the chat because I think I like this one. Have you experienced any pushback from agencies or individuals representing agencies when it comes to having a peer professional involved in crisis intervention services? And if so, how did you navigate, or how would you suggest that others that experience pushback navigate that situation?
I have not. I have not. I think we are, at least here in Arizona, we are at a point in time where we recognize the necessity of peer support. It enriches so many areas of this industry that, you know, the jobs here is just, there's so many peer support positions that are available. I personally have not seen the pushback. Now, if this was 7 years ago, I saw it, but things have radically changed.
I think I've seen some of that evolution as well. I think some of the, I don't know if I would call it pushback, but I would call it some fearfulness. And I remember this when I first moved to Wisconsin and was doing some education. And I would show up to meetings where it was all clinical providers, emergency workers, hospital staff. And I would say, yeah, there's this resource. And no, none of us are clinicians. Yeah, we're trained as peer supporters. And we support people who are going through extreme states and talking about suicide, and just the looks of fear. It would be like, what do you mean? What do you mean you're doing what? Tell me what? And it was just fear of the unknown. It was that the assumptions that happen because, again, there is still that ongoing stigma and discrimination around those of us who are psychiatrically labeled. Even with the best of intentions, providers still have that bias. And so it's just a matter of continuing to show up well, offer it as an alternative, to say it's here. And the more that people are able to see it, I think that is where the change happens, where we now have folks in communities who are those clinical providers who do head up major medical centers, who are some of our biggest champions, because they hear from the folks who have stayed at Pure Respites, who have said, this was transformative. This was unlike anything I've ever experienced. Peer support works for me. Please offer more of this. And I think that is how change happens.
Absolutely. Thank you both. So I think we'll have time for maybe one or two more questions. So this question is regarding the in the moment crisis situation, and if there are any standards in allowing the person who is experiencing crisis to lead the conversation, as opposed to a clinician or the peer support specialist leading that conversation, if that makes sense.
Could you say that one more time?
Yeah, so this person is asking if there's standards or maybe guidance on allowing the person who's in crisis to lead the conversation, as opposed to the clinician or the peer support specialist leading the conversation when you're talking about an in the moment crisis.
Okay, so my answer is going to sound a little clinical, but I'm hoping that it answers the question. It depends upon capacity, and this is where I'm getting clinical, mental health capacity. Is this, if you're walking in and a person is feeling depressed, anxiety, all of that there, they're able to have a conversation with you and tell you what's going on. Of course, they're talking, and we may be asking questions to figure out what's the next best steps for them. They're leading. However, if a person is in true psychosis, where, what they're saying is not, help me with this, the verbiage here, Vic, that it's not meshing together, then that's when I would say that the peer support or the clinician actually has to kick in to get yes or no answers, so we can figure out what are the next best steps. Because some people can clearly make a decision about what their needs are and what's going on with them. But when it comes to psychosis, sometimes, we've run into folks who have dementia and Alzheimer's diagnosis, and it's not piecing together. A decision, in a sense, has to be made for them as to where the conversation goes. Am I making sense right there?
Mm-hmm.
The person who did ask the question clarified that they're talking about the peer support specialist, I believe, leading the conversation, as opposed to, yeah. So sorry about that. But I think that you spoke to that a bit. But Vic, if you want to add your perspective there, that'd be great.
Yeah, what this is bringing to mind is that initial conversation when someone calls to ask about staying at a Pure Respite. And I think for that, what I do explain to people is that I do have a set of questions that I have to have a certain amount of information. So I'm going to be asking you some questions. And this is a place where you are also asking us questions. So this is a mutual kind of interview in a way, because I want to be able to provide that informed consent so that you know what you would be coming into if you chose to stay here. And you also know what we would be asking of you. And so that's about it. And then the rest of it is meant to be very open-ended. So, we don't ask specific questions about diagnosis. Because again, we're not clinicians, we're not assessing in that way. So it's more asking, what's going on? What kind of support are you looking for? This is what we can offer. How does that sound to you? What questions do you have about this? And so it can be a really free-ranging conversation. And again, that piece around is the person able to fully give consent, I guess, is what it comes down to. So for me, it's not necessarily about whatever experience they're going through or what their state of mind is, or whatever substances might be in their system. It's like, are you in a space to fully give consent and hold the values of the space when you come to stay? And so that usually can be negotiated through the conversation. And it is definitely more challenging if someone is experiencing reality in a different way. But I've noticed in my experience that sometimes there is that room that folks are able to still provide that consent, provide that information. And it's just a matter of maybe learning some different metaphors or speaking in a more creative way to get to that information sharing.
Thank you, Vic, for that perspective. So I know that there are a couple of questions that we were not able to answer, and we just have a few minutes. So I'd like to wrap up by asking you, Susan and Vic, both, if you have any final thoughts or anything that you wanted to share or reflect on before we end today.
First and foremost, I want to thank you, Katie. You've been working with us for a while to get this up and running. I want to thank the people of, NAMI and SAMHSA for sponsoring this. I want to encourage those who are in the industry or are thinking about being in the industry, or have a family member who is struggling because you came on here just for information, to, if you feel that you're called to do this, if you're called to do peer support, if you're called to be in this industry, then answer your calling. Answer your call. It's not one of these jobs where it's a 9 to 5. It's lived experience. You're leaving people better than you find them. And as you're leaving people better than you find them, you are leaving yourself better than you found yourself. Is this easy? No. Is it simple? Yeah. As long as you understand that you have to take care of yourself. And as Vic was saying earlier, can't save. It's not necessarily about understand that you can't help everyone. But if you make a difference, sometimes we're not there to totally fix somebody, but we make a dent. And if you can make a dent, then somebody else can make a dent. And if a person is supposed to change, they will change. But you do your part, and hopefully they will do their part. And thank you for having me on here today.
And I think for me, I would close just by saying, just encouraging people to continue to ask questions and to continue to be creative with finding new ways to talk about crisis, to talk about hard things. And I think the real power of peer support is in learning that we are all stronger than we think we are, that we can have hard conversations, and that it's not always something that we have to farm out to the experts, quote unquote, that we all know what it's like to grieve. We all know what it's like to go through times of intense distress, and we can connect on that human level. And I think the more of us that are willing to have those hard conversations, the more of us who are willing to say, you know what, I'm really scared and I don't know what to do, but I'm going to be here with you through it. That is where the transformation happens. And I hope that we can get to a day where we don't have to rely on services, where we are supporting one another organically in community. And that, maybe there will be times occasionally where a big crisis happens and we need to come together in community. But I hope that there will be a time where we're all better equipped to hold space for one another and to do that in community.
Thank you both. I have goosebumps and I'm getting a little teary, and I'm just really, really inspired by the work that you're both doing. And thank you for this beautiful conversation, for showing up with yourselves, for recentering that human experience in all of this. And thank you everyone for attending today. I know that I'll pass it on to Bailey from Nashville, but I did want to mention that on June 12th, we're going to have another webinar on peer support. It's called Connection in Crisis: The Impact of Peer Support, and that is also a partnership with SAMHSA, NAMI, and Nashville. And I will put the registration link for that webinar in the chat. So I'll hand it off to Bailey, but thank you everyone for attending today.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. This does conclude today's session. You may now disconnect.